All right. Well, welcome to Bâtonnage Connect, the virtual 2020 edition of Bâtonnage Forum. So on behalf of all of us at Team Bâtonnage, we're very excited for you all to be here today. We have a very exciting keynote discussion for you that we hope will educate and encourage all of us to communicate and keep up with this momentum to stir it up. So we're just about to begin, but before we do, a few quick housekeeping notes. First, you are all muted and your videos are off right now, and that will be the case for the duration of the webinar. But we do want to keep the communication flowing. So please note that there are two methods available to you participants, and that we encourage you to use them. So a chat section as well as a Q&A section. And these are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. So just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. And then there's the Q&A section. And this is where we'd like you to submit your questions for our speakers to answer towards the end of the webinar. We will do our best to address all of your questions, and we're happy to do some follow-up as well if we're not able to do so live. If you find yourself with streaming issues, you may want to encourage other members in your office or household to log off the internet, Netflix, etc., to save on bandwidth. And you may also want to log out and then try again with another internet server, such as Firefox or Chrome. And hopefully all of you have a seamless viewing experience. So next, we'd like to go ahead and introduce ourselves, Team Bâtonnage. I'm Katie Canfield. We've got Rebecca Johnson here, Ella Wingy, and then we have our founders, Sarah Bray and Stevie Stakionis. So, you know, this has been quite a year for all of us. It's been tough, it's been sad, it's been a roller coaster. And the way that this event has kind of evolved has really been a reflection of that. And I really wanted to take a moment and say that, you know, this community is what makes Bâtonnage so special. And we are so privileged to be leading it. And the outpouring of support and, you know, just help and just was actually remarkable. And I really just from the bottom of my heart say thank you to all of you. And I'm very proud to be in this community, people who want to speak out, people who want to listen, to learn, but more importantly, act. And I feel so grateful, we feel so grateful that we have this platform, Bâtonnage, to act upon. So without further ado, I'll introduce Stevie Stakionis here, who'd like to say a few words to kick us off.
Hi, we're here. You're here. In some ways, this whole broadcasting from our kitchen table thing feels really intimate to me. And in other ways, it feels profoundly isolated. I have opened Bâtonnage the last 2 years with wild screams of delight, like huge whoops and hollers that y'all echoed jubilantly into the sunshine and our large lawn, some like 300 to 400 of us physically and emotionally in glorious and unified community. And it sure looks different this year. Our whole world looks different, and an overwhelming part of me, I have to say, has not known how to handle the breadth and the profound depth of challenges that we're all collectively going through. I don't know where to begin. I don't know how to find the words. And I'm honestly not sure it's my place to say anything at all right now. I do know that we designed this forum with the explicitly stated intention of raising up the voices of those who have traditionally been overlooked or spoken over. So today, I recognize the privilege that I have had and how much I've already gotten to say, as well as how excited I am to hear from and learn from so many others that this year's organizers, Canfield and Rebecca Johnson, have incredibly coordinated. So I'm not going to say too much more. I do want to call attention, though, to our mission's stated conclusion, which is that we seek to propose pragmatic solutions for charting a positive, inclusive course forward. I really urge you to note those 3 keywords and to hold them close throughout our discussion these next few weeks. Positive, inclusive, forward. Jot them on a piece of paper, pin them to a sticky note on your desktop. Please let them guide your comments and your interactions, even more so through this digital divide. Each year, I have reiterated the same prayer for us, which is this. Let's face it, these topics are hot. We built them very intentionally with the belief that they are conversations that we are strong and brave and vulnerable enough to have. But they're also conversations that have the very real ability to tumble toward negativity, to turn otherwise well-meaning folks dark, or make them feel bitter, or instigate a fight or flight response. Inevitably, each of you will be disappointed in some aspect of the conversation, in the event execution, or our vulnerable moderation, or the way that that person over there said something controversial or uneducated or uninformed. But I pray again that these conversations would stay positive, that we would all remain hopeful, that we would be able to see beyond disappointment and toward the bright horizon. It may feel dark right now. As a matter of fact, I'm sure it feels dark right now. But your choice to be here right now shines so much light on our future. Onward, upward. Cheers to Bâtonnage 3.0.
Well, thank you, Stevie. So we're going to go get started with our keynote, and a special thanks to Gabrielle Glass for being our session sponsor. So thank you. So now we're going to go ahead and introduce Mary Frances Heck and Traci Desjardins, our keynote speakers this year. So Mary Frances Heck is the senior food editor of Food and Wine magazine, where she oversees recipes for the brand and edits stories about food and cooking. She is the author of Sweet Potatoes, and her writing and recipes have appeared in numerous cookbooks and publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Eating Well, and Epicurious. She is the former test kitchen director of Bon Appetit and worked in the test kitchens of Lucky Peach and Saveur. Mary Frances earned her bachelor's in history from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a degree in culinary arts from the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park. Traci Desjardins, a California native of small Central Valley agricultural community, Traci Desjardins has been a part of the San Francisco food community for over 30 years, operating a diverse group of successful award-winning restaurants. A dedicated philanthropist, she continually supports La Cocina, World Central Kitchen, No Kid Hungry, and Share Our Strength. Desjardins is a 2-time James Beard Award winner and has earned numerous industry accolades throughout her career. She serves as culinary advisor to Impossible Foods, assisting with their culinary development, and often serves as a spokesperson for the brand. Desjardins currently operates Public House in Oracle Park, the Commissary, and School Night, which opened in 2018 in collaboration with the Pearl.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Frances Heck, and I'm here with Traci Desjardins. And by here, I mean in your computer. We're sort of in opposite ends of the country at the moment. I want to thank, first of all, the Bâtonnage team. They have been absolutely incredible to work with throughout conceiving of this talk and planning and replanning this forum. So thank you very much to Katie, Rebecca, Stevie, Sarah, and Ella. When we first started talking about having this chat today, this keynote address, the world was a very different place, as we've mentioned. And in a few short months, many things have changed. Namely, every restaurant in America is pretty much closed. COVID-19 has swept the nation. and many other things have been brought to light about racial disparity in this country and the effects of systemic racism. And in planning in the last couple of weeks for this talk, we've gone back and forth a lot, but it became really clear that the initial overarching themes are more relevant than ever. And Traci and I had hoped to talk about primarily, we come from the food world, and so to talk about food as it can relate to wine from our perspective, but the idea of perspective took on far more meaning as we were going back and forth and talking about this subject. So I think more than anything today, we'd like to share a little bit about our stories and what we've done with our careers and what we know about food as it relates to wine. But I also want to touch on the fact that diversity brings richness and depth to all things, in particular food and wine, and that learning and discovery come through seeking out other perspectives and talking to people you might not normally speak with or know about. And that experience can only grow your passion and your excitement for this field. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to Traci and welcome. And if you'll tell us a little bit about your background, what brought you here today as a very accomplished chef, but also a really cool woman and an excellent water skier. So Traci, please tell us about that.
Thank you, Mary Frances. It's such a pleasure to be here today. And I want to thank you, Mary Frances, for bringing me into this and being willing to share what turns out to be a screen, not a stage, with you this day. And I want to say thank you to the Bâtonnage team for having me as part of this conversation. So I wanted to make a few remarks and tell you a little bit about myself. I want to start out by just saying, the extraordinary circumstances under which we are having this day and this conversation. We're on the heels of the Me Too movement, which still feels so fresh, and we're in the midst of a global pandemic, which has devastated our restaurant community and is changing the way that we're living on a day-to-day basis. We are just on the heels of the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Rayshard Brooks. And our country is in this pivotal moment where it is more important than ever for us to pay attention to all of these different aspects of the way that we live and the impact that it has on our communities. So I wanted to just say that before I got started today, talking about food and wine and about myself, and just give that backdrop, because I think it's an important backdrop to having this conversation. It's imperative that we make changes in our society so that every individual that we encounter have the same opportunities. And I think that really plays into the conversation that we can have today about food and wine, and people that are making wine and people that are making food. I'm a chef and restaurateur in San Francisco. I don't know whether I'll have any restaurants by the time this year is over. We will see what happens. I grew up in the Central Valley of California in a small farming community. My dad was a farmer. My mom's parents were born in Mexico, and so I grew up in an immigrant household with people who did not speak English natively. My paternal grandfather was from Louisiana. He grew up in the bayous of Lake Charles. And so my whole upbringing was about food. We grew food, we hunted ducks and other things that we ate. We raised lambs on our property. And I grew up in this community that was really, my family community, it was all about food. There were no processed food at our dinner table. There was no fast food in the town that I grew up in. And so that was my perspective. I graduated from high school when I was 16 years old, and I went to UC Santa Cruz. And I dropped out within the first year that I was there. It was a real struggle for me coming from a small town. I wasn't ready for it. I was too young. I had a wicked bout of depression that catapulted me out of school. And I was passionate about two things. I'd become an avid cook in high school, And I love to cook and I love to ski. And I decided that I wanted to be a ski bum. And my parents weren't so keen on that course of life for me. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to become a cook so I can do whatever I want. And I don't need to take money from my parents. And I'm going to be a ski bum. So I quickly started to sort of figure out like how I could become a cook. And I looked at culinary schools, and I actually applied at the California Culinary Institute in San Francisco, and they rejected me. That was kind of funny. Big mistake, I think. But anyway, here we are today. And so I landed an apprenticeship with Joachim Splichal in Los Angeles and started professionally cooking at 17 years old. At that point in time, there weren't restaurants like the French Laundry or Manresa or Dominique Crenn, and there were no Michelin stars in the United States. And I think everybody who wanted to enter into the culinary world really looked to France as the place to go. It had most of the Michelin stars in the world, and it seemed like the thing to do. And so I set off to do that in 1986, and I worked in 2 3-star Michelin restaurants there and 2 2-star Michelin restaurants. And all during that time period there, I was the only woman in these kitchens with, a brigade of 25 young men. And it was, it was quite the experience. And we have been, having this conversation, I think, in the culinary world for 30 years about, was there discrimination, and, is there discrimination, and how do we tip the balances and tip the scales and make things equitable. And I have said for a long time on those panels, oh, it was fine. I didn't feel discriminated against. I was the only woman, but, I didn't feel any bias. And I've said this many times on panels. And I've been reflecting on that in the last few years and really feel strongly that I have to recant that and say, yeah, of course there was discrimination. Of course it was harder because I was a woman. And it was really, sort of despite the fact that I was a woman, that I was successful. And I want that to change now. I think that, it's a focus that we need to have as leaders to be able to tip the scales and make that different now. And that there has to be a conscious effort towards that. And that's part of, kind of what I want to weave into this discussion today. It's imperative that people in positions of power are committed now to making opportunities for all people, regardless of your skin color, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, or your gender. We need to level the playing field and make sure that there are opportunities in education, business, government, and really focus our efforts. That's kind of how I feel at this moment in time, that's part of my commitment to the world that I live in of wine and food, that I want to make that difference and make sure that I'm doing everything towards that effort. Just to weave the story into the wine story into my food story, I'll give you a little bit of background of my wine education. I grew up with a grandfather who had a closet full of Louis Martini and Charles Krug wine. Something that you would maybe call a wine cellar, but it was really a stack of boxes with those labels. And I remember looking at those boxes in the closet. And that was my sort of first glimpse into wine as a kid. My parents started out drinking jug wine, and sometime when I was in high school, they really developed more of an interest in education around wine. And I remember going with my father. My dad worked a lot when I was little, and I didn't have a real strong bond with him. But as I got older, we kind of found commonality. And one of the things that we did was we went into Fresno to a wine shop. And I remember going into that shop and seeing labels for the first time, Chateau Montelena and Grigachels and Chalon and Beringer. And my dad and I would go up into the Sierra and fish together. And he would, he sort of started to let me taste wine and to sort of experience this early California wines. And so that was my first sort of glimpse into the wine world. In the late 80s, my aunt and uncle, who were huge, what you would call foodies now, I would call them gourmands at the time, they used to go to France twice a year, and they would go and eat in all the 2- and 3-star Michelin restaurants. And that was kind of how I got my foothold in the first place. Well, they had developed a cellar, and unbeknownst to myself, at that point in time, my wine sort of teething was on their house champagne, which was Biacart Salmon Rosé, and the special occasion wine that we drank was Taittinger Comte de Champagne. They had a special love for Burgundy, and I got to know names like Ramonet and Dujac and Jaillet and Lafon. And my early wine education was in those wines. And of course now, you know, I reflect back and I realize that I was drinking the best wines in the world. And that was my starting point in wine education. And I don't get to drink those kinds of wines that often anymore, but I feel incredibly lucky to have had that experience and have had that be, you know, my starting place in wine. Just to talk a little bit about food and wine pairing, I started in that endeavor when I was the chef de cuisine at Patina. I opened Patina in 1989. It was my first CDC job, and we were connected with the rarefied world of wine in Los Angeles. These great collectors. One of the fellows I remember is Bipin Desai. And he had this incredible wine collection, and he was a professor, and he used to do these lunches. And during that time period, I got to meet, you know, the amazing Martine Saunier, who was responsible for bringing so many great French wines into this country. And we did a lunch for Henri Jaillet. It was his first time ever in the United States, and he came and came to this lunch that I cooked at Patina. And so I got to start to know the French winemakers face to face, and was really part of this rarefied world. And that kind of culminated in meeting Larry Stone, who was working at Charlie Trotter at this point in time. Now it's sort of the early 90s. And Larry, I met him at Charlie Trotter, and he was, you know, one of the first American master sommeliers, and this extraordinary wine mind. We opened Rubicon together in 1993, and I furthered my wine education working with Larry with his incredible knowledge of food and wine pairings. And we did extraordinary things. One of the great events that I remember doing is 100 years of Pichon Lalande. And we did this vertical tasting of literally 100 years of Pichon Lalande. Eliane de la Cassagne came over, and it was a 3-day tasting. And, you know, these kinds of experiences that I had, you know, feel so rarefied, and it's wonderful to talk about them because they're just, you know, glowy and such great memories in my mind, and such a part of how I feel about food and wine. Yeah, so I want to have this conversation with Mary Frances. I wanted to give a little bit of my own background. You know, it's a period of reflection right now, I think, for all of us to reflect on, you know, how we're part of the solution, how we could be part of the problem. And, you know, from my perspective now, I know that there's so much work we have to do to heal our world in so many ways. And I want to be part of that, and I want to bring that into the conversation today and talk about how we can do that in relation to the subject that we are talking about today.
Thanks,
so, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. You say that sort of like glowy feeling and of that, you know, sort of era, if you will, but it seems like that's something in history now, just in that, you know, who gets to have those kinds of tastings again. So it's so cool to hear, and just to think about the kinds of wine and getting people together to celebrate about wine or with wine in that way.
Yeah, and to celebrate, you know, the way that we can, you know, change the world. I mean, I think that, you know, it goes without saying that, you know, when I reflect a little bit, you know, on my 21 years at Jardiniere, I think about the things that I could do differently or could have done differently to make the world a better place, and to give more advantage to, you know, women in the industry or people of color, you know, to really talk about that as part of my history. And, you know, I think that we're in this moment right now where we really have to force the change. for a long time, I thought I could just hire on the basis of who the best candidate was. And, when you sort of reflect back on what's going on right now, you realize that more often than not, that's going to be a white male, because they've been given the advantages to get to where they are, and just by virtue of the way where they were, they were born a white male, they have that advantage. And it's like, how do we tip that balance? How do we, we're talking about women in wine today. How do we tip the balance and make sure that women have the same opportunities in the wine world that men have, and really bring that into the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I'm thinking back to the first kitchen I worked in. I'll go with mini bio in a second, but the first kitchen I worked in, I was the only woman who didn't work morning pastry. And that was just mostly like making dinner rolls and pies and stuff. It was a, casual restaurant, but still there were it was a 375 seat seafood restaurant in New England. And I was the only woman who worked at night. And and sometimes there would be 30 cooks on a busy summer night. It was just full of men. And there was a rule that no one could touch me. That was how the chef could be sure that I would be okay. Right. Yeah. And it just sort of blows the mind and that wasn't very long ago. I'll say that. So my job now is as the senior food editor at Food and Wine, and it sounds like a fancy title, but it mostly means working very closely with recipe copy. And I do get to work with chefs like Traci Desjardins on their recipes and getting them into the test kitchen, getting them tested, and making sure our readers are able to create chef-like dinners at home. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of sort of back-end production work. There's some wine, there's some good food, but it's a lot of kind of like running a restaurant. There's always, trash to take out and things like that. So I also, I wanted to go to culinary school when I was finishing high school, and my parents didn't think that was the best idea. My dad did a full career in the hospitality industry. He's still alive and he still loves wine. And he, at the time I was born, was the resident manager of the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston. And I would say that this is sort of a white collar, blue collar kind of job, front of house management. But it was for a hotel that had 4 restaurants in it. And we lived in it. He lived in the hotel for, I want to say, over 15 years. And I lived there for the first 3 or 4 years of my life. And so I was sort of like baptism by fire, I guess. It was just sort of something, everyone in my family works in hospitality. And I'm pretty sure the first taste of wine I ever had was home wine that my uncle had made in Indiana. And, we always had wine at Sunday dinner. It was always around. It was always served with food. Very rarely would someone just have a glass of wine. In fact, when I got a little older and I heard that people just had glasses of wine, I was kind of like, with what? It was always part of enjoying a meal. And then I sort of was thinking about this talk, and I was thinking more about my family, and I was doing a little research, and it seems that back in Germany in the mid 1800s, my family had a vine house, like an inn that made wine. And they sort of, when they came to the United States, they were innkeepers. And, so there's been a long history of my family cooking and hosting, and it's always been, I would say, maybe like a holistic approach to consumption. But so thinking about the power of food and wine and gathering, I think is a real through line for me personally, and also in my job now. So my parents really didn't want me to go to culinary school because I think they knew how tough being a chef was. But I went to state college, and I persisted and applied anyway and started culinary school 2 days after I graduated college. with a laser focus on being a food and wine best new chef one day. An accolade you have.
Indeed. Thank you.
1995. Were you at Rubicon at the time?
I was at Rubicon, yeah. And it was Food and Wine magazine, Best New Chefs that year. And I think there were only 9 of us. Something happened. But anyway, and also James Beard Foundation Rising Star Chef of the Year. So I was 28 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
What an accomplishment. Yeah, so that was, I absolutely just wanted to be like a restaurant chef. That was my total focus. And then I found out, for your externship, you could, do any number of things. And I ended up applying for and getting an internship at Saveur magazine. And I thought it would be really cool to get test kitchen experience. At the time, it was basically impossible to break into publishing. So I was like, keep your options open kind of thing. And pretty cool options. But so it was an unpaid internship. I slept in my aunt's attic in New Jersey for 5 months and took the train in every day. And I felt so lucky because, as everyone knows, it's impossible to break into publishing if you don't have family support. And I was really grateful to have that family support. And I, later on, as I managed interns and externs in test kitchens, I could see how incredibly difficult it was. And you can immediately tell who really wants it and who is willing to put in the work. Because it's like cooking, but it's kind of a weird skill set that you really need to learn on the job. And so from there, I realized, so for context, I guess when I was an intern at Saveur, that was the same, like Gourmet closed while I was at Saveur. So it was like, cool. So now there are even fewer jobs to hope for in this arena. I realized that wasn't going to be realistic. So I started, still wanted to be a chef, but also started learning a lot about wine. And so my first job out of culinary school was in the wine industry in upstate New York, in the Finger Lakes. And so I really got to know Riesling. And then my old boss called and said he was going to go work at Bon Appetit. And if I wanted to come work in the test kitchen there, which I really did. So I did that for a couple of years. It was kind of a hard place to work. And so I wasn't sure if publishing was for me after that. And I went back in the kitchen. And so I continued cooking in New York for a couple of years, and then kind of peppered that in with some freelance test kitchen kind of work for cookbooks and things. And lo and behold, a decade later, I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and I work for Food and Wine. So you just really never know what your life will look like in 5 years. I can promise you that. But it's been cool because I've been able to get to know the California wine industry pretty well, coming out to visit a couple times a year and getting to meet all the people out there. So it's been really great. But yeah, so I think thinking about our, kind of how we got where we got, like, it's impossible to separate that, to tease that away from those formative experiences and how incredibly privileged, how great, I'm incredibly grateful, but I also acknowledge how privileged I was to even know what wine was as a kid. If you don't get started till after you're 21, it's tricky to catch up.
Yeah, it's true.
I will say that. But yeah, I think now for me, as you were saying, why is that white guy's resume the best one?
Yeah.
It's because of all those experiences.
Yeah. And, I feel like I was able to have those experiences, like, as I said earlier, just despite the fact that I was a woman, and that I had such, a keen desire to, optimize my experience in those restaurants in France. And it didn't matter that I was the only woman and that there were a million obstacles in the way. I was willing to do it, but it shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be that hard. And it shouldn't be that hard for people to enter into the wine world, or, to do whatever they so desire, if they should all have equal opportunity to do so. So that's,
yeah. I think, to me, it's a huge question of access.
Right.
It's how do you get those opportunities? And recently somebody brought up the idea of gatekeeping, and how do you get your foot in the door? How do you get your resume in front of that chef who you really want to work with? How do you get that first test kitchen experience? Because without it, you won't learn the skills. Passion can carry you so far before experience has to take over.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, that's a good question. I personally have always been incredibly open to, people who come to me, personally and ask for, even if they don't want to work for me, which is fine. I know pretty much every chef in the country, and I say this to young people. It's like, you gain that entry, you set a goal for yourself, you dream big. And I think the same can be said of the world of wine. Find somebody that can help you get in that door. And I try to be as accessible as possible at every juncture. If somebody asks me for help, if they ask me for business advice, if they ask me for an introduction, I always try to say yes and do everything I can to. And I think that, perhaps everybody's not like me, but I think that you have to have that hope that, and keep knocking on those doors to try and gain access and to get through that door that you really want to walk through, and dream big.
Bang on the door until they let
That's right.
I know. I feel like that's what I did. So I think, I think it's hard for us thinking about how the food industry and the wine industry work together, but are kept separate in many ways. What are some concrete things? Because I think in one of our chats prior to this, we were talking about how, wine is viewed as a luxury. It's not an absolute necessity. I would kind of argue with that, but, with a sort of a wink and a nod. But food is already too expensive for some people,
Right.
And the food system in this country, I think some real issues with it have been, that you or I were probably aware of, are now very publicly aware. I think for me, something that just felt really gut-wrenching during the early days of COVID was someone dumping milk because they don't have the right containers to put it in to get it out to the market. And then there was a milk shortage on the market too, because everything was going to food service when it could have gone to a grocery store. So
yeah, or the meat crisis that was driven by lack of access to slaughtering facilities, and hundreds of thousands, millions of animals being killed and destroyed, when there are lots of hungry people in this country. It's
so I think it's well, I think it's really hard to unwind both of those things from economics and income, and what you can then use that income for. At least that's where my mind goes somewhat immediately.
Yeah, and it's as you said earlier, it is a privilege to be able to experience wine, to work in the wine world. I think that it's it feels it's I think when we started on this keynote, we were talking about really food and wine pairing, and then that was it was before COVID happened, and it was before the recent strife in our country, and it was going to be a conversation about food and wine pairing, and I think we both felt the imperative to weave a larger context into that conversation. Yeah,
for sure. And I think the thing that you can't separate from all of it is labor, right? It's and that goes for hiring policies, and whether or not you make $1 more or less on a restaurant job, versus whose resumes are even considered in the first place, and what qualifications you need. And so what are some things in your mind from a restaurant perspective, and I can speak to publishing too, but in that food world, what are some concrete things that can help create formative experiences for young people, so that they have, to help level that playing field from that guy's resume, or for their resumes?
I think we have to force the change. That we have to realize that that we should look around us and make sure that we have diversity in every workplace. And it might mean that you are not hiring the most qualified candidate, because that is going to be the white male, for many different for now. But we have to force that change. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We have to make sure, when I reflect back, on what I could have done at Jardins in 21 years, I never wanted to have a female only wine list. But now I look back and I'm like, why didn't I? Why wasn't I using my buying power and my leverage and my ability to make it any way that I wanted, and say, great, I'm going to feature only women winemakers. And I know a lot of folks are doing that now, and I think it's brilliant. And it's let's tip the scales. Let's give advantage to those who haven't had it in the past, and use all of our resources to balance things out and make that change happen in every opportunity that we have.
Yeah. I think I also see that the Q&A in the chat is blowing up.
Okay, let's talk about it.
I'm excited. So we're going to just chat for a couple more minutes, and then I want to open up the Q&A a few minutes early, because I'd really like to hear other people's perspectives, because we don't know everything.
No. Definitely not.
Yeah, like by a long shot. So, but trying to focus on this a little bit. It's, I think about mentoring, and you have to have someone who has that bandwidth. Even when you don't know what your manager or the person who oversees your employment, if they have the ability to, they could be spread incredibly thin. I'm just thinking of reasons why it's hard to have a mentor. Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest problems with the concept of mentoring is that mentors want to see themselves in the person that they give their time to. And what that means is that they end up mentoring potentially little clones of themselves. And it's something that it's slippery. It's very hard to point a finger at it as a problem, but I think it is one. And I think in terms of those hiring practices, or who gets an internship, or those kinds of things, you need to start hiring people because they have the qualifications or the potential to have the qualifications, and not because they are just the same as everybody who already works at your organization and will fit in socially or whatever. And that's something that I've sort of been thinking about concretely as a step forward. But I know I would really like to hear from other people about that as well.
Yeah, I'm a little flat-footed right now because the rug has been pulled out from under me in the context of my work life. 0 restaurants open, and don't know whether any will reopen at this point. And so it is, it's a strange inflection point just in the context of the culinary industry and restaurant world, for sure. So
it is, and something else I've been considering too is just. All schools are closed too. And so how are people going to get education and experience? And I think that what we're doing right now, if you can tune in virtually and learn a lot that way, it sort of calls into question what people will want to see on resumes. Will they need to see terminal degrees in certain fields, or will it be possible to learn on the job, or, something over YouTube even that could spark imagination and get someone, cooking in the kitchen or what have you. So,
yeah, I mean, I think, it goes without saying what is going to evolve from this pandemic in the context of restaurants. I think we're going to see so many changes in the way that restaurants operate. And I think along with that will be changes in the qualifications of the people that come to work in restaurants, because we don't even know. I mean, we don't even know if the kitchen is it gonna look the same way, or is everybody going to be in little silos? I mean, what's going to happen? We're at this moment in time where we really don't know.
Yeah. Well, let's keep chatting. I think this could be a really great time to open up the Q&A. I see that there are hundreds of comments, and
Where are you seeing those? I guess I don't have mine on here.
I see something on my bottom toolbar here.
Okay, here we go.
A lot of hot topics. So we'll start with one for Traci. Traci, have you seen things improve for females in your world? And if so, how do you think those changes came about in particular?
I think, it really goes back to what I was saying earlier about, forcing the change. And, I think that leaders in our industry, I know I didn't run a kitchen that was largely female dominated, but I do know of a lot of my colleagues that have, mostly women working in their kitchens. And I suspect that they did force the change, that maybe they had the foresight before I did to populate their kitchens with women and support women to be, more successful in their kitchens. I don't know the answer to that, but I just reflecting on my own behavior. What I needed to do was to just make sure that my kitchen was at least 50% women, and I didn't do that. And as a result, I had a lot of white men in my kitchen. And, I look back on that and I wish that I'd made it different. I wish that I'd really forced that change. I do see some of my colleagues doing that and successful in that. But we still have to continue to unlock the answers to that question.
Did I ever tell you that I staged at Jardins?
I think you mentioned that to me when we were at Food and Wine last summer in Aspen. How many days?
I was just, I think 1 or 2 days.
Was it awful?
No, it was great. I had a really good experience, and I will say it was probably mostly guys on the nights that I was there.
Yeah.
But it was a really good, it had a good culture. And I'm not just saying that to blow smoke up your ass. I actually thought it was a great experience. And
what year was it? Do you remember?
2008 or 9.
Okay. All right. So kind of the middle of its life, I guess.
Yeah. It was a packed restaurant.
Yeah.
It was
yeah.
cool.
I mean, I have a lot of regrets. I was trained I have regrets in the way that I ran my kitchens, because, when I was thinking about, this talk today, and I was thinking about, what could I have done differently? And there's a part of me that just wished that I had just made absolute rules about how I hired and said, you're always going to have 50% of the staff be female. Whatever those parameters, whatever you're able to sort of establish for yourself as what those are for you, we have to force that. We have to make it happen, because it's not going to change by itself. And I think I was so habituated to the, European male, militaristic style kitchen. It was how I was trained. It was my entire experience. And, I let that be the majority of the culture of my kitchen. And I have regrets about that, but at the same time, I have to let myself off the hook because I didn't know any different. There was no example that was set for me. But when I hear Gabrielle Hamilton talk about the fact that her kitchens are largely female, I think, well, how did she do that? How did she make it different and make that so? And could I have done the same thing? So that's what I reflect on.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Hindsight's 20/20, and
Absolutely.
And you know so much more than you did yesterday. So I think in that regard, but I hear you too. And I think as I was coming up, I sort of just, I had short hair and I'm 6 feet tall, and I just was one of the guys, and I could just keep my head down and not listen to the weird comments, and maybe had a pretty different experience than a lot of women do in kitchens, but it wasn't without maybe breaking off a little piece of myself and leaving it at home or tossing it away to keep it safe,
Yeah.
Because you do put on armor in those situations.
Yeah, in a lot of different ways. Yeah, and that was, that's how I survived the French kitchens. I pretended like I didn't understand what they were saying. And that just, muffled all the noise. And I did, but it was a way for me to not hear all of the cat calls or whatever it was that they were, saying to mess with me. Just tuning it out.
We have quite a few questions, just switching gears a tiny bit, about age. So we've had quite a few questions that we're asking about folks that are starting to get into both the wine industry, the food and beverage industry, later in life. So sort of 30s, late 30s and beyond, and sort of what your experience has been, what your thoughts have been, and a little bit about your career advice for both of those.
Do you want to start that, Mary Frances?
Yeah, Mary Frances, you want to start that?
Well, you do have a leg up because you're over 21. So you've been drinking wine. No, I would say it's sort of like with all things. It's wherever you are, you're going to be bringing something that's unique to your perspective. And I think that's actually something I wanted to sort of get to with this talk too. Regardless of your background, I think everyone should view where they're coming at a subject as beneficial to them, because they're the only one who can tell the story in that way and experience something in that way. Every person out there is a particular market for, whatever wine or food or whatever is being sold. I think that price point is the biggest barrier for most people. But beyond that, I don't know of anyone who sells something who doesn't want to sell it to everyone. And so I think thinking about what makes you unique as a selling point for jumping in. The one thing I will say is that I am a person who was born in the 80s, I'll tell you that much. And I am more tired than I've ever been in my whole life in about the last 2 years. And so something happens in your mid 30s that just makes you tired and get hangovers. So 2 things I would recommend taking into account when you're deciding how much or what kind of environment you want to work in. I think at that point, many people decide to get off the floor or get out of the kitchen and do something kind of different. So that's the only thing I would point out.
Yeah, and I've got, I think, probably 2.5 decades on you, Mary Frances, because I was born in the mid 60s, and I'm worn out. I mean, I still have a lot of energy, like my mind and sort of, my physicality. I love to be on my feet. I love to, I still like to work, but, when I wake up in the morning, my hands don't work. And, I couldn't be a line cook today for sure. And so, to your point, think about what your attributes are and what you have to offer. If you're older, you've probably, you perhaps have had a great education in the career already that can be applied in some way to what we do. And, the nice thing about the culinary industry and the world of wine is it's expanded so much in the almost 4 decades that I've been doing this. It's, there are just so many different aspects to it, and being able to find your niche and the maybe sort of something that complements your background that you've already established if you're coming to this late in life.
Great. We've also had quite a few questions related to mentorships and mentees, and sort of looking at sort of how, if you have any organizations that you're aware of that can link up and potential mentors and mentees, how do we go about finding a mentor if you're interested? And then in terms of mentorship, mentors having to really understand and respect a mentee's background, skills, race, and how do we make sure that the mentors do the work to really listen, especially when the listening and the talk is uncomfortable. So any advice from either of you on the mentor-mentee sort of relationship and experience? Traci, or either one. Yep, go ahead.
Mary Frances, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit. So I would say that a couple things. Being a mentor is volunteer work. And I mentioned earlier the bandwidth thing. I wouldn't seek out the busiest person you've ever met as a mentor. If you're looking for a close guiding relationship, that person might not be able to give you what you want. or what you're looking for. I would also seek out as many people as you can and try to have a cup of coffee or a glass of wine with them and just ask them a lot of questions. Most people are really happy to talk about themselves. Hello, just for an hour, and they're happy to answer, just get them to talk and share what they know. Because you never know what you're going to learn in an hour, never mind a 10-year-long relationship. I think that, beyond that, research and figure out who does what you want to do. Like, do you have a goal? I think that's a great place to start too, is where are you trying to get, and who can help you get there. So I think having a clear goal, I have a lot of really awesome cooks in the test kitchen, and some of them laser focused, always wanted to be in a test kitchen. Others sort of found themselves there after doing other things. And when they ask me for like recommendations or something like that, I'm always happy to do it, but I'm like, what are you trying to get out of this experience? And if they can't articulate a goal, it's really hard to help give advice or help connect them to the right person. So that's the main thing I would think about. And I'm also, you can grab my email after this. I'll put my email up, and anybody can feel free to email me if you want. I'll connect you to anybody that I know, if you think they could be helpful.
Great. Question for both of you. Have either of you, kind of changing directions too, have either of you had success in engaging male colleagues and helping to champion the advancement of women? And if so, how?
Absolutely. I mean, there are, lots of amazing men in our industry who have, large female staffs. I think it's, I think that there's a consciousness towards, trying to tip those scales, and that there are some great examples of colleagues in my industry that are champions of women and believe that, they are every bit as able to work in kitchens and contribute in meaningful ways in the wine world. So yeah, I have lots of examples. David Kench, at Manresa, he's had a huge female staff there, and he's obviously 3 Michelin stars and has always really believed. And I have lots of lists of others like him.
Great. Traci, I've got a question. Traci, a question just for you. I appreciate you recanting the idea that you didn't face discrimination as a woman coming up. I've heard this before from women chefs and somms of your generation. My experience was very different. This is coming from an attendee. I'd love to learn more about what has made you look at those past experiences differently now.
I think, the reflection that we've been having the same conversation for 30 years, it just occurred to me, on a panel, probably 5 years ago, why are we still having this conversation? And, it was obvious to me it's because nothing's changed. And, why hasn't it changed? And, I have to look at myself and say, what part of that have I been, how have I contributed to that story? And what can I do now? It's the most important thing to me right now at this inflection point is how can I make a difference for the industry that I'm involved in going forward? I feel like I'm probably kind of getting towards the end of my, active restaurant career. I'm not done yet, but, soon. And, what can I do now to make a difference? And that's where that reflection comes from. And I want to be honest with myself and really look at it and think about what I might have done differently and what I can facilitate in doing differently going forward.
Great. And then one for you, Mary Frances. Media, at least in editorial, is built on the ability to take advantage of unpaid labor like yours. Don't you think that that's also a form of gatekeeping? What are ways that the media industry can more proactively address that, even considering their smaller margins post-2008?
Yes. So I think an important thing to note here is that the kind of internship that I did, which was extremely common and very formative for me, is now illegal. So it's less likely that you'll be lured into an unpaid internship without great grounds for suing that company. But that said, I would say that, how do you break in, I guess, is the question. would you say, Rebecca?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
here's the real answer that I would give someone who's trying to get into media today. Consider what media was even 10 years ago, media, and think about what it is now. So if your job, if your dream is to make glossy magazines and nothing else, I don't know of that job existing anymore. I work on print magazine, books, digital recipes, digital features, video. We produced about 700 recipes last year, and I want to say, give or take, maybe 300 to 400 were for the print magazine. So that's like half. So thinking about what a media job is, I think is really important first. I'm happy to talk further about this and sort of my take on it, but think about the power of social media and think about all of the other ways that you can get the word out about that thing you're really passionate about writing about. And all I would say is there are many more ways in because there are many more forms of media.
Right. Okay, so question from Beverly. In reflection, would you say that in the 90s and early 2000s, that there was great power in being a woman leading a kitchen of men, especially after the catcalls, discrimination, etc.? Is it possible that it wasn't until women leading in the F&B world became more frequent that mental and emotional space could be made to pivot to deliberately tip the scales towards encouraging more women and people of color? And what can that mean for our next chapter?
That was beautifully said. I think that was, I think that's very, very true. You know, obviously we are in a moment of great pain in our country with regards to race. And I think that's the next chapter. I think that, you know, women have infiltrated the ranks of the top restaurants in the country, although the numbers are still not what they should be. But, you know, we need to see more people of color having opportunities. And I think we are at a point where that absolutely has to change. And we need to continue to push to have that balance for women, but for people of different skin color should also, you know, have the percentages in kitchens in the culinary world and the wine world. And we need to force that change. And I think that that's what's next.
Right.
I hope that's what's next.
Yeah, agreed. Where do you think food and wine writing and media is going with most of the restaurants being closed? What are some of the most interesting stories or media platforms that are being told in wine right now, given the current situation?
Well, I mean, obviously Food and Wine is the premier publication on this topic because they pay me to say that. No, but you know, so our July issue, and I don't know if y'all have seen an image of the July cover for this year. Our restaurant issue is in July every year. And this year we were just absolutely thrilled to celebrate our best new chefs, our best new restaurants. And there you go. And look at all of the trends that were bubbling up and, you know, just absolute delights in the food and wine world. And as COVID took down pretty much every restaurant in the country, when we were going to print about 6 weeks ago or so, we were unable, first of all, to get all of the chefs together for the traditional group shot on the cover. And so what you see here are their gorgeous portraits nonetheless, but you know, we weren't able to get together and celebrate them. And then our coverage changed really quickly. And today, if you go to foodandwine.com today or pick up an issue of this magazine, if you can find, you know, in a store or your subscriber, there's a really good package out that I had nothing to do with called The Future of Restaurants. And it was spearheaded by our restaurant team, Kushbu Shah and Osset Beber, along with the entire editorial staff. And it's under our umbrella of Food and Wine Pro. And it really looks at all of the factors that are affecting the restaurant industry right now. And so in my mind, we've got food and wine as it relates to the industry, but I work more closely with the recipes and sort of translating chefs for the home cook. And so we've seen a real uptick in people engaging with us about recipes and really excited to try new recipes at home. If you've made sourdough in the last couple of months, you might have gotten the recipe at Food and Wine. So we're seeing a huge demand for interesting and well-explained recipes. I can't answer, I can't speak to the future, but I do think home cooking and gathering in new ways is going to be key, just like we're doing right now. We're still enjoying wine. You might have dinner for 2 or 4 on Thanksgiving this year instead of, the usual 12 to 16. But yeah, I think people are going to get creative with it, but I think it's also calling on everyone to stay connected. And I think that's kind of what we're thinking about too.
Great. And an interesting question from Nicole that sort of follows that pattern of what ways do you think it might be possible to start incorporating digital portfolios and digital stages as a way to opening up hiring practices to those who have struggled to get their foot in the door in the past?
I think it'll be really hard to stage in a restaurant online, but we all love Top Chef, right? Or shows like that, cooking TV. And maybe you could pick up if a cook knows their stuff, Traci.
Gosh, I haven't challenged myself with that yet, Mary Frances. I'm a very intuitive person. I'm not sure I could get that through the screen, but maybe.
Maybe. I think publishing, absolutely. There's a ton of wiggle room there, or a lot of room for improvement, I should say. But something I've been thinking about doing is actually just like holding Q&As once a week for people who want to do the work. If you've gone to food writing conferences or any kind of writing conference, there's always this like pitch slam thing that people will do where they've got like a bunch of like amazing editors sitting at a table and people will be like, well, what about this idea? What about that idea? And it's kind of an awful experience, frankly, but it is a really good way to understand how you could take an idea and craft it for a particular, writing outlet. So I would say, also just like cold email people at this point. Everybody's looking for great ideas. So yeah,
Right.
Publishing has no excuse to not incorporate that.
Let's throw one to Traci then, from Katie. With the opportunity to pause and reevaluate during this pandemic, what changes are you most excited to see in the restaurant industry going forward?
I don't know what we're going to see. I think it's really interesting the level of engagement that people have, having been, trapped in their homes for 3 months now, with regards to cooking. And I think that will bring a new perspective to the consumer in relation to restaurants, which I think, will end up being something really interesting. But I can't predict what's going to happen. I mean, I really don't know, what restaurants are going to look like in the future. Will we go back to the way they were when there is a vaccine? That's a question. I suspect that we won't, that there will be changes that will be permanent because they're going to make sense. But I think the future is very unknown, and we don't know how this time period is going to affect the future of restaurants. I don't think we can quite see what that's going to be yet. But I do think that there will be permanent changes in how we operate restaurants as a result of this. I just really am a little flat-footed in predicting what those are.
All right, so heading back over to Mary Frances, what is the difference between an extern and an intern? You had mentioned these earlier, so I have a question on that.
Okay, it's a really boring answer. Liability. For an externship, the school maintains liability of the student. For an internship, the company does. That's my understanding of it anyway.
I'm so glad you answered that.
Looking a little bit to the both of you and sort of how you've been managing during this this current time period, what are you both doing for self-care or to manage stress besides wine time? Something different.
I mean,
I personally, I think I said to myself about 1,000,000 times before this all started that time was my most precious commodity. And so, I've really been trying to take stock of that and really take this time not to be overly busy. I could make myself overly busy on any given day. But I've been taking time to myself. I've been enjoying that time. I've been spending time in the mountains, which I absolutely love, spending time with my son, exercising a lot. It's a little bit of a kind of an addictive thing for me, I think, but it does help me keep my head straight. And, it's challenging. I mean, I suffer from, bouts of anxiety and depression and always have. And it's a challenge during this time period. I think that, we have to be soft and empathetic and gentle with each other and listen and understand how much everyone around us is under tremendous amounts of stress. I think everybody's sort of teetering on the edge and really looking at the people that we're with or the people that we come into contact with and understand what their pressure points are. Do they have financial insecurity, whatever it is. And just really try to be as empathetic as you possibly can be at every opportunity.
Great. And then we have sort of a two-part question that came in, and somebody is piggybacking on that. So I'm going to direct this to both of you. So I'll read the question in its entirety. It's how might Mary Frances and Traci reflect on leadership, looking inward now to open their internal allegiances with people of color, joining their teams, finding entry points. And the question that sort of came before that was, Black people do not have the same level of success even when they bang on the doors. Oftentimes the door is opened and someone tells them to go away. So I'd really appreciate added thoughts here. We'd love to hear a little bit about that. How can we force that change practically? And in addition to seeking mentorship for access.
Yeah, I think that is the question that people are considering right now. I know that at the company, I work for Meredith Corporation, which we refer to as the mothership. We have a diversity inclusion department within HR, and I'll give you that it's a new department for sure. That they have been extraordinarily helpful in helping to recruit and tap into networks that have not traditionally been part of publishing recruitment. I can personally speak to hiring in the test kitchen. I don't oversee the test kitchen, but I work very closely with the test kitchen, which is a central agency within the company. Our test kitchen, Food and Wine's test kitchen, also helps develop recipes for Southern Living, Real Simple, lots of 20 plus other Meredith brands. And they, before our hiring freeze, had 4 open positions that they had difficulty filling because we're in Birmingham, Alabama. I can tell you that living in Birmingham, Alabama costs about 1/4 what it costs to live in New York City, where every other test kitchen is located. So I do think that when you think about access, when you think about opportunity, and not having just the cash on hand to sign a lease in New York City, for this company in particular, that is changing. So I would really encourage anyone who's interested in going down that road to just get in touch with me directly, please. And again, if I'm not the right person, I can try to connect you with the right person.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not currently running any restaurants of my own. I feel very lucky that I sold Jardins last year and I closed Mijita. So the 2 restaurants that I owned and the other ones that I'm still involved with are all consultancies. So and those are I'm not the absolute boss and the final say in those organizations. So although I do definitely have influence, I I think that through a lot of the work that I do with the nonprofits like La Cocina, I think that I can actualize a lot of the change that I want to see. And I work with the immigrant population, largely women, largely immigrant population at La Cocina, to advise and support and work to try and tip the scales and have those women own and operate their own businesses. I constantly lend myself to them as an advisor and do a lot of the work, actualize a lot of the work that I do through that. You know, again, and I've said this several times, you know, I think that we all have to be self-reflective and force that change. And it can be addressed through HR systems and inclusive workplace work. You know, we're all figuring this out, and I am personally committed to working as hard as I possibly can to make these changes happen. And I'm always all ears. You know, feel free to reach out to me directly, and I will do whatever I can do to help open those doors and make sure that they stay open.
If I can just add one more thing to that, you know, I would also say that getting your work, what you do out there is obviously very important, so that people know, you know, what you bring to the table. And I would really recommend getting involved with some of the listservs like Equity at the Table, which is a food organization. Julia Turshen's, I guess it's kind of a listserv. It's a website where you can go and you can learn about all of these incredible women creatives in food. And it's a lot of queer women, a lot of women of color who have put essentially their portfolios on her site, and it's a great way to find talent in different cities. When we're maybe doing a photo shoot, we can go there to look for food stylists or photographers.
We're going to try to get in a last few here. I know we're just about at time, and there's quite a few questions still outstanding in the Q&A, so we're going to do our best. And of course, we can certainly try to follow up afterwards with some email communication. But one thing that keeps coming up quite a bit as well is the concept of wage transparency and living wages, given the current situation. Are there ways we can start to address this differently across the industry, especially in the post-COVID era?
Well, I think it's sort of a different question for maybe folks who work hourly in restaurants versus manager jobs or things like that. Just in that, personally, I think we need policy around hourly wages, and I think that's something that has to come on the legislative level. I mean, obviously, it matters who you vote for, but I would say that that's probably the most important place to start that will impact the most people. And so I think the Fight for 15 is a good start, but you know, nobody can live in a city for $15 an hour, or should be expected to. And so where do we take that to the next level? Because redistribution of resources is going to be the number one thing that's going to allow people to survive these crises, and then into the future help level the playing field.
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer that question right now, just given the state of restaurants, and thinking, certainly, you know, thinking about fair wages and a higher minimum wage was a very relevant topic when I was operating restaurants, and I'm sitting in a very different place now. And so it's hard to kind of put that into context of the future of restaurants. What I can say is that the economic model for restaurants has been broken for a long time. It's something that I said, you know, for years, and it's the reason that I closed my own restaurants. We need a new model, and in that new model, we need to include fair wages and transparency and better distribution of income across the board in restaurants. And it's something that's been broken for a long time. It still needs to be fixed. I don't know what the path forward is, but it's certainly always at the forefront of my mind.
Great. Well, I think on that note, like I said, unfortunately, there's quite a few questions still outstanding. It's a good sign of a great conversation, one that's just getting started. So I'd like to turn it back to Mary Frances. Any final words, Traci? And we'll end the Q&A there. So thank you both.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to I just want everyone to take a moment with their glass. First of all, cheers and welcome. Thank you all so much for putting this together. It's been a real honor just to be affiliated with Bâtonnage and to get to know all of you. And I think for me, the great lesson is always to keep true hospitality as our touchstone in this industry. And I don't mean hospitality as it translates into a white tablecloth restaurant. But I do mean the welcome table and sharing and giving and nourishing each other with both food and drink and your thoughts. So thank you very much.
I echo that, Mary Frances, and thank you all for having me here today. You know, I've always said that it's such a pleasure to do what I do and to be in the world of hospitality and cooking. I've always said that I have the funnest job in the world, which is to bring people into an environment and take care of them. And, you know, it's been said that hospitality is like a warm hug. I think hugs are probably the thing I miss most about the world that we're living in these last few months. And so I just want to say that I'm extending you guys all a virtual hug, and thanks for being here today. And thanks for listening.
Thanks, Traci. Cheers, y'all.
Great, and
Cheers.
thank you, Mary Frances, thank you, Traci. That was truly a fascinating conversation. We knew it was going to be a loaded session with lots of comments, questions, etc. And as Rebecca said, you know, we are going to do our best on the back end here and try to get those answered, and hopefully we could include them in a recap to all of our attendees. So just a little bit of housekeeping again. Next up for Bâtonnage Connect is going to be a session on vineyard workers, what's really going on. So join Elaine Chacon-Brown, Leda Isabel Garside, and Rory Williams as they dig into the state of the industry for vineyard workers, while also giving tangible ways for the rest of us to best support them. So that's going to take place tomorrow at 11:30 Pacific. So we hope to see you all there. And then also just a note to say, you know, these are our charity partners this year for 2020, Southern Smoke Foundation and Race Forward. Both, you know, just organizations that we're so thrilled that we're going to be able to donate these proceeds to, thanks to all of your support. So with that, we'll leave you and hope to see you all tomorrow.